Hi everyone, welcome to our public health biostatistics video presentation. I'm Gianna Mastroraco.
And I'm Jameson Bish, and today we're presenting our research project, which is based off the survey that we conducted during this class.
Our research topic is the perception of safety on Ohio State's campus. Instead of looking at actual crime rates, today we're going to be focusing on how safe students feel on campus throughout a day-to-day basis.
And that's really important because perception of safety can impact behavior just as much as real safety. If students don't feel safe, they might avoid certain areas, change their routines, or limit going out at night.
So even if a space is considered safe, if students don't feel comfortable, it can still negatively impact their daily lives and overall well-being.
Because of that, campus safety isn't just a security issue, it's also a public health issue, since it affects mental health, behavior, and access to campus resources.
So, throughout this presentation, we will be discussing the different factors that influence Ohio State students' perceptions of safety based on the survey data that we collected from undergraduate students.
So, starting off with some background, campus safety is an important public health concern, especially at night when students may feel more vulnerable. At Ohio State, there have been several recent reports of crime both on and near campus, many of which have been covered by the Lantern, which is Ohio State's student-led newspaper. Even if students aren't directly involved, hearing about these incidents can even influence how safe they feel. Because of this, it's important to understand what factors might shape students' perceptions of safety in their everyday environment. These contributing factors are what led us to our research questions.
From there, we developed four main research questions targeted at Ohio State undergraduate students to help guide our study. First, we asked whether thinking about campus safety is more often associated with feeling less safe at night. Second, we looked at whether the number of times a student is on High Street impacts how they feel. Third, we examined whether living on campus versus off campus affects perceived safety. And finally, we explored whether gender influences how safe students feel at night. Overall, these questions allowed us to examine both behavioral factors, like how often students think about safety, and demographic or environmental factors, such as gender and living situations.
For this slide, we want to explain the justification behind our research questions and why they matter. Prior research shows that environmental factors such as lighting are strong predictors of how safe students feel on campus. This is especially relevant at night when visibility is lower and concerns about safety tend to rise. In addition, crime reports in areas like High Street, right along Ohio State's campus, highlight that these safety concerns are not just perceptions but are tied to real world risks. Research also shows that perceptions of safety can vary across different groups. For example, students living off campus and female students have been found to report lower feelings of safety. Together, these findings support why it's important to examine how factors like safety, awareness, location, and gender relate to students' perceptions of safety, specifically at OSU. Moving on to our methods, we collected our data using a survey that we created in Qualtrics. We used a convenient sampling method, which means we distributed the survey through people we could easily reach. For example, I asked my friends and people who lived on my floor, and I also sent a survey to class discussions. Gianna did the same thing, as well as sending the survey out to her sorority group chat. This approach made it really easy to collect responses quickly, which is definitely a benefit. But at the same time, it also introduces some limitations because our sample might not represent all Ohio State students equally. For example, certain groups could be overrepresented or misrepresented, which means our results might not be fully generalizable to the student population.
After collecting the data, we analyzed everything using RStudio. We set our significance level at 0.05, which is standard for statistical testing. For our first research question, we used a one-way ANOVA test followed by a Tukey's test. The one-way ANOVA test compares the average values across multiple groups, which made sense because we were looking at different levels of how often people think about safety. And the Tukey's test was performed to determine exactly which groups differed from one another in their mean perceived safety at night. This helped us to identify where those differences occurred. For our second question, we used linear regression. That allowed us to test whether there was a relationship between two continuous variables, high street frequency, and perceived safety. And for our third and fourth questions, we use Welch two-sample t-tests. These tests compare the average between two groups, like on-campus versus off-campus, or male versus female. For all of these analyses, we reported summary statistics using means and standard deviations.
Before we discuss our results, we also want to describe our sample. After data scrubbing, we had 124 respondents. About 80% of the sample was female, followed by 18% male, and then about 2% identified as other. The average age was around 20 years old, and majority of the participants were underclassmen, specifically sophomores. The sample was also predominantly white, with small representations from other racial groups. This graph shows a brief overview of the results of our tests. The ANOVA, Tukey's test, and both two-sample t-tests showed p-values under 0.05, while our linear regression test showed a result of 0.4523, which is above the limitation that we set. Starting off with our first research question, does thinking about campus safety affect how safe you feel at night? We found a statistically significant relationship between these variables with an F statistic of 7.14 and a p-value of 3.45 times 10 to the minus fifth. So we reject the null hypothesis. Looking at the group means, students who never think about safety had the highest perceived safety score at night, with a mean of 0.86. In contrast, students who thought about safety more frequently reported lower scores. For example, 0.05 for 1 to 2 days, negative 0.15 for 3 to 4 days, negative 0.83 for 5 to 6 days, and negative 0.46 for every day. The Tukey's test confirms that all these groups are statistically different from 0 days group, with p-values ranging from about 0.009 down to less than 0.001. Overall, this suggests that students who think about campus safety, even occasionally, tend to feel less safe at night. This makes sense since greater awareness of potential risks can increase concerns or anxieties. For our second question, we looked at time spent on High Street and if it correlates to perceived safety at night. After performing our linear regression, we actually found no statistically significant relationship. The line had a slope of 0.12136, meaning that for every one time a person was on High Street per week, the perceived safety score tended to decrease by 0.12136. Regardless, the p-value for the regression line was 0.4523, which I mentioned earlier, which is above 0.05. So we failed to reject this null hypothesis, meaning that how often students are on High Street doesn't seem to impact how safe they feel at night.
For our third question, we looked at living situations. We found a statistically significant difference between students living on campus and off campus. Off campus students reported feeling less safe compared to on campus students. And as shown in our table, the mean perceived safety score for on campus students was 0.341, while off campus students had a lower mean of negative 0.133, with similar standard deviations. The Welch two-sample t-test resulted in a t-statistic of 2.42 and a p-value of 0.01763, indicating that this difference is statistically significant. This suggests that living conditions do impact perceived safety at night, which could be due to differences in lighting, security presence, or proximity to campus and resources. Finally, when looking at gender, we observed a very strong difference in perceived safety at night. Female students genuinely reported feeling less safe compared to male and other students. Looking at the data in our table, male and other students had a higher average safety score of 0.76, while female students had a lower average of negative 0.16. The test results support this gap with a t-statistic of 4.92 and a p-value of 1.071e negative 0.05, showing that this difference is highly statistically significant. Overall, this indicates that gender is an important factor in how safe students feel at night, which is consistent with broader research on fear of crime and gender-based differences in safety perception. Overall, our findings highlight that students' perceptions of safety at night are influenced more by personal and situational factors rather than by location alone.
Factors like safety awareness, gender, and living situation play a much larger role in how safe students feel than simply how often they're in certain areas like High Street.
This reinforces the this reinforces the idea that campus safety is not just about reducing crime, but also about improving how safe students feel in their environment.
And because of that, this becomes an important public health issue as it directly impacts student behavior, well-being, and access to campus life.
Thank you for listening to our presentation, and we hope our research provided some insight into how students experience safety on campus.